I want to thank the elder for his welcome and his prayer about humanity, and to the ladies that sang those great songs from different nations, not just from the people of the Haudenosaunee people nation. I thought that was a way of showing respect for others and consistent with the relationship that we have tried to engage with the colonizer. And it began with us as Indigenous people, trying to solve our differences occasionally through war, but more hopefully towards peaceful arrangements. And that's part of our history that we have to remember. I like the theme of this conference, the rise of the fourth world. When I was growing up in Grand Rapids, there was only one world, and that was mine, and that was the Cree world, because we were fairly isolated in the early part of my life from the rest of the country. And I knew no other language, no other way of thinking, no other way of believing, no other way of living. And sometimes I look to that time with nostalgia, because it was a period when the people were strong. They had not been totally impacted by colonization, although they had experienced it for several thousands of years through trade and commerce with S&B Company, and through the making of treaties with the British Crown. We were aware, of course, that we were not the only people occupying the world, but insofar as my community was concerned, we were the majority. And I had no concept of what a minority is, and no experience with discrimination as a child. These were sort of like events that came later, when you get exposed to a different society with different beliefs, with a different history, with a different worldview. And you begin to appreciate that in their context, you are not that significant. That in their context, you're not only a minority, but in their context, in their way, you are standing in their way of their progress. And that's a very difficult understanding to accept in a peaceful way, because it creates anger inside you and a strong denial that you refuse to accept the rebuke of your people by the dominant society. So you become politicized very early by encountering a larger society that was like a bulldozer to you and your people. The rise of the fourth world, in many ways, would be like the reclamation of my community as being back to the majority, back to being in control of their destiny, and being back to a position of authority and power where others have to relate to them as equals, not as inferior beings within the context of how Canadian society views our people. Growing up as a Cree, Gimineng Tenina Exesip Matsian, I was happy that I was raised that way. Ayuanis, pakan gisina patena ninan aski, pakan mistoems tuuso gisuapat tamag. Because we saw the world differently, and we soon learned that the larger society also had a worldview that was in conflict with ours. Grand Rapids experienced probably one of the worst forms of colonialism that any community would experience. And that is resource development. The province of Manitoba wanted to develop hydropower, and we live by a source of tremendous power called the Grand Rapids, Mississippi. And they decided, without consulting my community, that they would proceed to develop a dam right in Grand Rapids, which they did. That's the reason why we don't have any more rapids in Grand Rapids. You know, we just have a dry riverbed that used to be the Mississippi. But the worst thing about massive resource development that does not respect the rights and views of your people is that what they call displacement. And displacement is not only in the context of unemployment. Displacement does not just mean being put aside in the name of progress. Displacement is being put in an inferior status, as having no rights whatsoever to complain or to negotiate an arrangement like compensation. These are traumatic things that happen to people, and they stay forever unless they're dealt with through a healing process, which has been absent in our community. So we still struggle with the impact of hydro development. And that will not be any different than what might happen in other parts of our country, including the Ring of Fire, or any of those communities that are standing in the way of a pipeline in the western part of our country. They will experience what I experienced if their rights are not respected. If they have no voice in terms of shaping the economic development in their region, they will be impoverished by the resource development. Not only that, the impact is also about the idea of seeking a livelihood when your livelihood has been spoiled by hydro development, when your trapping industry has declined completely, 100% because of the hydro dam, and because your commercial fishery is declining too for the same reason, your people are struggling for a livelihood. So you get impoverished by resource development that does not have any respect for your right to a livelihood as a people. And the worst thing that happened to me was the loss of our territory to the west side of our community. A total of maybe 90 square miles of land underwater because of the hydro dam in Grand Rapids. A hydro dam that not only impoverished my community, but also put our neighboring Cree community, Chimahoin, underwater, where the reserve is underwater and the gravesite is underwater. So these things have a lasting impact on your psychology, and you struggle with it all the time in terms of your relations with Canada, your views of Canada. And they inform a lot about how you deal with these issues, and sometimes how the anger comes to the surface. And no one can escape that. Not even the most kindest people in the world can escape the anger that comes from being despoiled by a country that they welcomed, by people that they welcomed. When I look at resource governance and indigenous rights in the global economy, I fear that given the state of our country in relation to the conservative ideology that dominates all the resource development in Canada, that our people will have to fight. They will have to stand and fight to make sure that they are not ignored and that their rights are not set aside. It's not a very good place to be right now in Canada if you're a First Nations person. And the reason I say that is because when it comes to things like the Northern Gateway Project, which is going to connect the Alberta oil sands to the BC coast, that process will likely be approved because the Conservative government has weakened the environmental assessment and regulations for any future projects like that. And I'm afraid that even though most of the First Nations communities in that region are opposed to the Gateway project, that the government will deal with them in the same way that past governments dealt with my community, as standing in the way of progress and people that need to be put aside in the name of economic development. I read something in the Globe and Mail a couple of days ago about the announcement by the Minister of Resources, who was arguing the same argument that I learned later on was made in Grand Rapids. The argument was that society needed economic development to create jobs and a quality of life for its citizens, and that the hydro dam was essential for the infrastructure that the province needed for future economic development projects. And now we're hearing the same argument in relation to the Northern Gateway project, that this is critical and essential to the economic well-being of Canada. And it's a kind of argument that resonates well with the Canadian people. And why does it resonate well for them? Because this is their country. They believe that they're entitled to a quality of life, that they want a good house, a secure job, and maybe a two-car garage for their vehicles. But they have this idea that they must have these possessions in order to feel economically secure, and to make sure that economic security is available for their children and their grandchildren. And the reality is, they make up 37 million people compared to 1.3 million Aboriginal people in this country. We don't have the luxury that the blacks have in South Africa to reclaim our land. We can't do it through the vote. And it is impossible, under the circumstances, for our people to create a livelihood with the reserve system that exists right now across the country. When you add all the reserves of Canada and compare it to the landmass of this country, it's 0.03% of the landmass of this country. It is virtually impossible, no matter how brilliant the people are, to create an economic standard of life that the rest of Canada wants with that little piece of land. The fracking issue is also one that I think is very troubling, because I know that when it comes to water, that our people understand what that means, and they will stand up to any development to prevent fracking from happening in their territory. And I say troubling because, again, we're dealing with a society and a government, or governments in Canada, that are adamant in getting economic development, and they will do it at any cost. And you can see that when people resist, when the Aboriginal people resist, Canada will send its police officers, the RCMP, and if necessary, as they did in Oka, they will send the army. We know that these are all possibilities in terms of any resistance that Aboriginal people take in this country, that Canada will respond with force. And that puts us in a very awkward position, of trying to maintain a peaceful coexistence with the rest of the country. And yet we have to, because we will never win a war against 37 million people. And we can't afford to pick up weapons in retaliation to any resource development, including fracking in our territory. That the resistance always has to be a peaceful resistance to development that we can't support. If we go the road of violence, we will certainly lose. And we have enough of our people sitting in the jails of this country as it is right now. We don't need any more of our people going to jail. We live in a country where civil rights and individualism and individual rights is for the general population, not for the Aboriginal people. When the general population gets involved in dissent and also in protest, not all of them will be the subject of surveillance by the nation state. Any Aboriginal people, any Aboriginal leader in this country of prominence has been under surveillance by this country at least once or twice in their life. This is the reality in which we live in. We live in a country that has even set up the Governance Operations Center with a mandate to do surveillance on quotation mark citizens, and they have in fact even been present, according to the Ottawa Citizen, and I believe the Ottawa Citizen before I believe the Government of Canada, that they have even tried to collect intelligence from a healing dance in Kenora and a pipe ceremony in Edmonton. I mean, how far do you allow your surveillance to go into the heart of our people, into their ceremonies, and that they're coming there not to enhance your prayer or your ceremony, but to come and report back to that Government Operations Center on whether you're a threat to this country or not. Since when has prayer been a threat to any country? And when did our ceremonies become a threat to Canada? These are the questions that I have, because I know that because of OCA, that Canada will use force on our people. I have known that. And that the only way in which we're going to win is not to meet it with force, but with trying to find a peaceful way with them. And this is our tradition. This is part of our history with them. That's why we have so many treaties with the British Crown, treaties of peace, treaties of coexistence, and treaties of alliance, to try to work together and to work together. But Canada has yet to accomplish that with us, because they have no interest, really, in my view, to work together with us. They just want their way. They want to impose their worldview, and they want to accomplish their goals, and they will do it at our expense. Take, for example, the National Energy Board, and how even the National Energy Board was collecting intelligence on the opponents to the oil sands, because they wanted to know who was opposed to it. And this is troubling to me, that when a government spends so much money on surveillance of people and then cuts back on Aboriginal funding for political representation, you have to question, where is this going? It's a worrying sign, I think, not just for First Nations people, but it should be a worrying sign to Canadians that protest and dissent are closely becoming an act that can be criminalized in Canada. We have to be mindful of that. that perhaps maybe the country has gone too far to the right, and that Canadians need to assess if they want to live in a country where their governments can collect intelligence about citizens who are protesting or dissenting against government, or that they want to live in a country where there's freedom of speech and freedom of association, a guarantee in their own charter of rights and freedoms in this country. What vision do they want? And what are the chances then of that kind of thinking becoming fixed in the minds of the Canadian population, and it becomes part of their understanding that it's okay for government to conduct surveillance on Aboriginal leaders and organizations and groups in protest? If it's okay for the minority, what does that say in terms of democracy in Canada? Where is it going? And how close is that to fascism? I mean, how close are these conducts to fascism? Now, go look in a dictionary for the definition of fascism, and you'll see elements of that definition happening in this country already. If that's not of a concern to the Canadian people, it's a concern to us as Aboriginal people, because we will be the victims of any move to fascism in Canada. So we have to be, I think, on guard that when we talk about the rise of the fourth world, it's not just about the decolonization of our people. That the rise of the fourth world is not just the implementation of the UN Declaration of Indigenous People. That the rise of the fourth world is also about reminding our settler to behave themselves. To remind the settler that they have a duty to humanity and that we are their conscience. But if we resort to violence, we will be no one's conscience. That's why we have to maintain this peaceful coexistence as part of our philosophy in relations to Canadians and their governments. Because in the absence of that, we will not be any better than they are. We will become like them. As a boy growing up in Grand Rapids, people might say I was naive, but I'll say I wasn't. I was more pure then than I am now as a human being. So when I believed in this idea of respecting elders, showing respect to all people, being mindful about sharing and kindness and all these beautiful values that our people have, I was not being naive, I was being pure, I was being complete. And then when you enter the relationship, like with Canadians, and you become part of Canada, and you go to university, and you become a lawyer and all these things, you experience a kind of dissonance, not just a conflict of values, but a dissonance of being. Like, who are you now? Who have you become? And where are you going with this new identity? Do you want to maintain this new identity, or do you want to somehow revert to the original one that created you, the one that was more pure than the one you have now? You know, these are not just philosophical questions. These are really important questions of identity. These are the ones that deal with the very core of you, the very spirit of your being, the very heart of your nature. And we need, I think, to appreciate that our values as Indigenous people belong to the world, not just to ourselves. But the problem that I see, though, and having been involved in the politics of our country for so long, is that we tend now to deal with what people call social problems or the day-to-day needs of our people, and we forget about what's most important, and that is the philosophy of the people, what guides us in our conduct with others. So we become so preoccupied with trying to find money for housing, for education, for infrastructure, which are all essential things that people need, that we forget to spend the time that we need to think about how we can rise up our people, how we can make sure that they are enshrined with that philosophy that will uplift their own personality, but also will put them in a situation where they will want to uplift the well-being of others. So we have to come back to basics, things like that. We have to think about these ideas, about what our ancestors had, and how we can bring that to the forefront as our contribution to the world in general. So what is it that we have in common? The people from Australia, Central and South America, the United States and New Zealand, or indigenous people in general. What is it that we have in common? Is it the colonial experience? Is that what we say we have in common? Yes, we have been impacted, obviously, by settlement, the loss of resources, the loss of self-determination, all these losses that we have talked about for decades and decades. But what we have in common is our worldview, our perspective of our place on the earth, on the planet. And it is this worldview that needs to be shared now with the rest of the world. But how do we do that when the sharing of knowledge is controlled by nation states? And that it is nation states, for example, that send observers to the Ukraine. But there's not a single First Nations observer in the Ukraine. It is nation states that decide who goes to the United Nations. There's not a single First Nations people from this country that is in the United Nations. These world vehicles of expression, like the United Nations, for example, are controlled by the nation states. So we have no direct access to say, Jose will go sit there. We have no mandate, no authority to designate Jessica to be there. We don't have that authority. So our worldview never gets to be expressed, not even with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where I think our worldview would have a dramatic impact in terms of creating a concept of peaceful coexistence, which is part of our personality as people, part of our culture. So that is what we have in common. The colonial experience is what brings us together. But that dialogue is about oppression. That dialogue is about injustice. We need to have it, of course, to change things. But we don't need to focus there. We need to rise up as a people. We need to say to the rest of the world, we are still here. And we have a lot to offer to world peace. What else do we share? Well, the other thing is in the context of colonization, I call it the reverse castle. You see, the Europeans, at least the people with power and privilege, created castles as a way of protecting themselves from potential enemies, but also as of sheltering their people from potential enemies. Now, here in Canada, they didn't create castles in the same way. They did it in the context of law. The idea of the rule of law became their castle. This is the castle that impacts on daily life. Not just on daily life, but it impacts on the future. Not just daily life, but the future. It's about conduct, it's about relationships, and it's about what the society will allow in relation to development or progress. The rule of law is the new castle. That's how they make sure that we cannot break into the rule of law. That's how we're kept out from impacting on how environmental regulations will be conducted in our territories. They make the rules, and we're supposed to comply with them. That's the castle. That's what I call the castle in reverse. Because if you take it another step, you have to look at the reserve as a creature of the colonizer. Because we have territories, not reserves. The reserve is a creature of the settler. And that is the castle that they gave us. And that's where they want to keep us, on the reserves. We don't want that castle. They need to take it back. And that simply means they have to change the rule of law. They have to recognize that we have the right of self-determination. And they have to start believing that only they can decide what laws can be made. And they have to stop assuming that if we have lawmaking power, we will abuse it. Because they believe that if we have lawmaking power, we'll abuse it. And that's why they don't give it to us. That paternalism is part of that castle that surrounds the reservation system. And it's called the Indian Act. That is a castle that we don't need, a castle they should take back because we didn't make it. What else do we have in common that might be instructive in terms of how we work together in the future? Well, what we have in common is at the local level, at the ground level in each of our communities, there is still the foundational beliefs that survived colonization. And in our communities, there is always people there, not just a handful, but by the hundreds, who want a better life than what they're experiencing right now. They want change. So our communities are ready for change, but they don't want change coming from the top being imposed on them. They want a change to come from them to move forward. In other words, change to bring back the Cree majority. That kind of change where you are in authority, where you are in control of your destiny. You are no longer a subject or subservient to the settler. And that can be accomplished without conflict. That can be accomplished without war. Because that can be accomplished by the direct action of our people, by doing something constructive in their lives right now, not waiting for permission from the Indian agent or the Minister of Indian Affairs or the Prime Minister, but proceeding to transform their communities, to make them better, to make them viable, to make them stronger than they are now. So that's what we have in common. We have people ready for change. The other thing we have in common is that in relation to our relationships with the nation state, we have a voice. The voice has been growing since the 1960s, but it's getting stronger and stronger every decade. And that voice is not just the elected representatives that speak for us. That voice is coming from the elders and from the hereditary chiefs, from the Confederacy. It's coming from different sources, not just elected leaders, but educators, academics, students, as was evidenced by Eleanor Moore. So you can see that on a regional basis, we also have, at the early stages of an idea that's bubbling, ready to be utilized for a positive change. People are ready at the regional level to change the discourse we have in Canada. People want to move away from the castle and bring back their own indigenous identity, their own self-determination, their way forward. It's another thing we have in common. Now, here at this meeting, what is it that we're trying to achieve? We're trying to understand, I think, what else we can create in common as Indigenous people. Now, we heard from the academics talking about the need for collaboration and cooperation and organization. Yes, we need all those three things. But what we need the most right now, in my view anyway, is that each one of us who's here and those beyond here, we make a commitment, not just to stay connected, but to bring a movement of internationalization of our rights. And how do we do that, other than just talking about it? Well, we have the blueprint. The blueprint's there for us to pick up and make it happen. It's called the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. Our mission is to implement that, to implement it in every country where we have been colonized. And we begin today. I'm 68 years old now, so I've got to see some change here. Hurry up. Make me feel proud before I'm 78, right? Because if we work together on the internationalization of Indigenous rights by implementing the UN Declaration in our respective nation states, we will transform the world. Of that I am sure. And that surely should be part of our mission. It's like coming out of our people. Enough of the castle and the reservation. We have to come out to our territory. But beyond our territory, we have to come out and share ourselves with the rest of the world. This is the challenge that I think we all share. Right? And this is nothing new, really, except that we need to do it on a concerted basis, and we have to create a mass support for it. It's not enough just to have a handful of people. We have to make sure that this thinking is also at the community level, at the regional level, at the national level, not just the international level. I know we can accomplish this, what I'm talking about. Because what we still have is our spirit, and that is the most powerful thing. And every human being has a spirit. And the spirit doesn't need language to connect. The spirit is present all the time. And we have to remember that each of us has the power to transform not just our lives, our community, or the country, but humanity in general. I am a student of sociology, I'm a student of history, I'm a student of politics. I'm a perpetual student. So I learn many things. But what I've learned so far, in terms of all the readings I've done, is that political thought is always European-based political thought. Social thought is not purely European-based because I've read some Eastern philosophies and thoughts. But absent from all the literature, absent from all these readings that I've had, is the indigenous beliefs, the indigenous thoughts, the indigenous political beliefs. And we need to do something about bringing them to the forefront, because I know it is there. And it's not absent in our lives, it's still present in me as it's present in you. But we need to sort of, like the prayer you gave this morning is a good example. And the songs that we heard, songs about water, these are all indigenous ideas. And that song we should teach that song about water to all the children, all the children in Canada. And by the time they're 12 years old, they'd be very opposed to fracking. That should be our strategy with Canadian children. I think I'll stop there because someone said to me, don't talk too long. And, I've been known to talk for a long time, and I ramble on as well. But I have a lot of ideas. I've learned a lot in my political role, but also growing up in Grand Rapids, being impacted by a mindless resource development that almost destroyed my community. One other thing I wanted to say is this. What else, and finally, what else do we have in common? We still have the political will. Right? See, this is something that no colonizer can change. No colonizer can capture your political mind. So we still have that. They might have impacted the way we dress. They might even impact the language that we use. They may well have impacted, in some ways, the way we think about democracy. Thinking democracy as they think. When in fact, if we were to go deep into our roots, we were the most democratic people. That we didn't use words like equity, equality, and things like that, but we just lived them. That we lived equity, we lived equality. And that when it came to this idea of political will, it was not the political will of one strong person, one dictator. It was the idea of the community's political will. The consensus democracy is part of our history. And that has been challenged also by the Indian Act, which has tried to put us into this idea of majority rule and simple majority of the council. That denies, our virtual existence, who we really are. Actually, not virtual existence, but who we really are. Where people have to be heard, make the decisions, not just a decision by one or two people in council. So these are all thoughts I think I want to share with you. And Ken, it's up to you now because you put me just on the pedestal. I have a difficult time living up to that standard that you set. But maybe there's some questions from the floor, then I'll try to respond to them.